In this video, we're going to do something a bit different. I'll be reviewing a PCB design sent in by one of the members in my Skool community. And this one is a Macropad built around an ATmega32 with LEDs and switches. First of all, I just want to say this is seriously impressive, especially considering the designer is only 17 years old. Getting into PCB design at that age and actually completing a full project like this is not easy, so huge respect for that. The goal of this video is to go through the design, highlight what's done well, and also point out areas that could be improved, both from a schematic and PCB layout perspective. Now, just to be clear, I'm not an expert. I've been doing PCB design for a few years, so I'll be sharing my experience and how I would approach things, but there's always more to learn. So if I miss something, or if you have a different opinion, feel free to drop it in the comments. That's how we all improve. Alright, let's get into the design. Alright, let's start with the schematic. Depending on how long this review ends up being, I might split this into two parts, with part 1 focusing on the schematic and part 2 going over the PCB layout. So let's begin. One of the first things that immediately stands out to me is the way the power symbols are used. This triangular symbol is most commonly associated with ground. It's not a strict rule in every tool, but in general, it's widely recognized as the ground symbol. So using that same shape for VCC can be a bit misleading at first glance. In this case, it's labeled as VCC, which helps, but visually it can still cause confusion, especially for someone quickly reading through the schematic. A better approach is to follow more standard conventions. Typically, power rails like VCC are represented using a bar-style symbol, while ground uses the triangle. That way, even without reading the text, you can instantly distinguish between power and ground just from the shape. And even better than just labeling something as VCC is to be specific about the voltage level. Instead of just writing VCC, it's much clearer to label it as something like plus 5 volts or plus 3.3 volts. That removes any ambiguity and makes the design easier to understand, especially for others reviewing it or for yourself later on. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with using the bar symbol for ground. I've done that myself in some designs. But if you do that, then it becomes important to explicitly label it as GND, since you're no longer using the more universally recognized triangle symbol. On the other hand, if you stick with the triangle for ground, you usually don't need to label it because the symbol itself already communicates that clearly. So overall, the key takeaway here is consistency and clarity. Stick to common conventions where possible, and always make sure that someone reading your schematic can understand it quickly without second guessing what each symbol represents. Continuing with the labeling, another thing I notice is that a lot of the data signals on the right side are defined using power ports. Personally, I wouldn't use power ports for these types of signals since they're not actually power nets. Power ports are typically reserved for things like VCC, ground, and other supply rails. For regular data signals, I would stick to simple net labels, like you've already done in some other parts of the schematic. That keeps things consistent and makes it clear that these are just signal connections, not global power nets. Another small but important detail is how the net labels are connected. Instead of placing the net label directly on the pin, I would recommend drawing a short wire out from the pin first, and then attaching the net label to that wire. This might seem like a minor thing, but it really helps avoid issues where a net label looks connected but actually isn't. Especially in larger designs, it's easy to miss a tiny misalignment, and that can lead to unconnected signals that only show up later during PCB layout or design rule checks. So, by always placing a small wire first and then attaching the label, you make the connection visually clear and much more reliable. And speaking of wiring, the four-way connection is definitely a no-go. This is one of those rules in schematic design that you break once and then never again. When you have a four-way junction, where 4 wires meet at a single point, it becomes very hard to visually confirm whether everything is actually connected the way you intended. Depending on the tool, grid, or zoom level, it can even lead to situations where some connections are not electrically connected even though they look like they are. That's why this kind of connection is generally avoided. Instead, you should always break it up into multiple three-way connections. That way, each junction is clear, readable, and unambiguous. You can already see better examples of this elsewhere in the schematic, where the connections are split properly, making it much easier to follow the signal flow and verify that everything is connected correctly. It might seem like a small detail, but these kinds of habits make a big difference, especially as your designs get more complex. Moving on, I can see that the capacitors are labeled quite well. You can clearly see the value, the designator, and even the package size, which is great for readability. Personally, I prefer to only display the designator and the value to keep the schematic a bit cleaner, but that really comes down to preference and workflow. What's more important is consistency and making sure the key information is there. One thing I do notice though is that some components are missing designators, and that's something you definitely want to fix. Every component in your schematic needs a unique designator, otherwise the software won't be able to distinguish between them if two components share the same designator. Or if one is missing entirely, it can cause confusion not just for you, but also during annotation, BOM generation, and later in the PCB layout. So even though it might seem like a small detail, making sure every component has a proper and unique designator is essential for a clean and functional design. Next up, let's take a look at the necessary circuitry for the ATmega32. Starting with the decoupling, this is done really well. A common rule of thumb and what I usually follow is to place a 100 nanofarad capacitor for each VCC pin and make sure it's positioned as close as physically possible to that pin in the PCB layout. The idea is to minimize the loop area and provide a very low impedance path for high frequency noise directly at the source. On top of that, it's also good practice to include one or more bulk capacitors, typically in the range of a few microfarads, placed a bit further away. These help handle slower, larger current transients and stabilize the overall supply rail. So, conceptually, you can think of it like layers. The small capacitors handle high-frequency noise right at the pins, while the bulk capacitors support the system at a lower frequency level. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning, especially as you move into more advanced designs, is the use of multiple capacitor values in parallel. It's very common to see something like 100 nanofarads, 1 microfarad, and maybe even 10 microfarads, all connected in parallel on the same rail. The intention is to cover a wide frequency range, which sounds good in theory, but in reality, each capacitor has its own parasitics, like equivalent series resistance and inductance. And when you combine different values, you can actually create resonance peaks in the impedance of the power distribution network. This becomes especially important in high-speed designs, where the switching frequencies are much higher and the power integrity requirements are more strict. In those cases, blindly adding capacitors of different values can sometimes do more harm than good if it's not properly analyzed. However, for a microcontroller like this, it's usually not something you need to worry about too much. These devices operate at relatively lower speeds, and the internal power requirements are much more forgiving. So in most cases, simply following the data sheet recommendations will give you a perfectly stable and reliable design. Still, it's good to be aware of these concepts early on, because as you move into more complex designs, things like power integrity, impedance control, and PDN behavior become much more critical. And that's definitely something we can dive deeper into in future videos, especially when working with more advanced systems. The clock circuitry looks solid overall. It's good to see a proper crystal being used, along with a clear description and part number, which makes the design much easier to understand and reproduce. One thing I do notice though is that the designator is missing, and that's something you definitely want to fix. Looking at the load capacitors, I would assume the values are correct, but that's actually a very important detail to verify. Choosing the correct load capacitors depends on the crystal's specified load capacitance, and getting that wrong can affect frequency stability or even prevent the oscillator from starting properly. It's a deeper topic on its own and definitely something worth covering in a separate video. Another thing I notice is the capacitor size. They are using 0805 packages, which is generally fine and very common, especially for beginners or hand assembly. However, in most cases, it's better to go with smaller packages like 0603 or even 0402. Smaller capacitors have lower parasitic inductance and capacitance, which improves performance, especially in higher frequency circuits like clock networks. They also allow you to place them closer to the microcontroller pins, which is exactly what you want for a clean and stable oscillator circuit. So overall the structure is good, just a few improvements in labeling and component selection would make it even better. Moving on to the LED array, this is actually done really well. It's great to see that each LED has its own decoupling capacitor, which is exactly what you want, especially with addressable LEDs where stable power is important. The chaining also looks correct, with D out connected to D in from one to the next, forming a proper data chain. That's exactly how these types of LEDs are meant to be connected. One small thing I would add here, and this applies to the rest of the schematic as well, is handling unused pins. If you have pins that are intentionally left unconnected, it's good practice to place a no ERC marker on them. That way, when you run electrical rule checks, they won't show up as warnings or errors. It helps keep your design clean and makes it clear that those pins are intentionally left unused rather than accidentally forgotten. Looking at this encoder here, I actually can't tell for sure if it's even the correct component, since there's no part number defined. Right now, it just has a generic description that says encoder, which isn't really enough information to go on. This is something that's very important in any schematic. Every component should have a proper part number. The part number tells you exactly what the component is, what its specifications are, and most importantly, what you need to order when it's time to manufacture the board. Without it, you're basically guessing later on, which can lead to ordering the wrong part or not even knowing what footprint or electrical characteristics to expect. So even if you're in an early design stage, it's a really good habit to always assign a real specific part number to each component. It keeps your design clear, reproducible, and ready for production. Moving on to the USB connector, this part is done really well. It's great to see that you've included a fuse on V-bus for protection and also added series resistors on the data lines. That's exactly what you want for a proper USB interface, helping with signal integrity and protecting the circuit. One thing I would consider adding is ESD protection. Typically, you would place ESD diodes on the data lines and also on V-bus to protect the device from electrostatic discharge, especially since USB connectors are exposed to the outside world. That said, since this is a prototype board, it's not a deal breaker if it's missing, but it's definitely something to keep in mind for a more finalized design. Another improvement I would suggest is related to the differential pair definition. For the USB data lines, I would define both sides of the series resistors as differential pairs in the schematic. This makes things much smoother later during the PCB layout, because the software will already recognize them as a differential pair. That way, you don't have to manually set it up during routing, and it reduces the chance of mistakes. It also helps ensure proper impedance control and cleaner routing for the USB signals. One important detail when defining differential pairs in Altium is to use _P for the positive signal and _N for the negative signal. If the naming doesn't match this format, you can still manually define differential pairs, but using the correct naming from the start saves time and reduces the chance of mistakes. For the last part, let's take a look at the switches, starting with the reset button. We know that the reset pin on the ATmega32 is active low, which means the MCU resets when the pin is pulled to ground. Now looking at this circuit, it's technically correct, but it's a bit misleading at first glance. The resistor here looks like a pull down, which would imply that the reset line is constantly being pulled low, effectively keeping the MCU stuck in a reset loop. But if we trace it properly, it's actually connected to VCC, so it's acting as a pull-up resistor, which is the correct behavior. This ties back to what I mentioned earlier about symbol choice. Because the VCC symbol isn't immediately clear, it can create confusion when quickly reading the schematic. So electrically it works, but visually it could be improved to make the intent more obvious. One small addition I would recommend is placing a 100 nanofarad capacitor from the reset pin to ground. This helps filter out noise and prevents accidental resets caused by spikes or unstable signals, making the reset line more robust. So overall, the circuit works as intended, but a few small tweaks would improve clarity and reliability. Looking at the switch circuits here, they are very simple, and honestly they will probably work just fine in many cases. But there are a couple of things to keep in mind when dealing with mechanical push buttons. Depending on the quality and manufacturer of the switch, they can be surprisingly sensitive. Even a light press, or sometimes just slight movement, can cause very fast, noisy transitions on the signal line. This is what we call switch bouncing, and it can result in multiple unintended triggers instead of a single clean press. Because of that, I almost always add some form of debouncing in hardware. The simplest way to do this is with an RC circuit, just a resistor and a capacitor. Something like a 10 kilo ohm resistor and a 100 nanofarad capacitor is usually more than enough for most applications. This smooths out those rapid transitions and gives a much cleaner signal going into the microcontroller. Another thing I personally avoid is relying only on the internal pull-ups inside the MCU, like on the ATmega32. While they do exist and can work, they are typically quite weak and not very well defined in terms of resistance. That means their behavior can vary and you don't have much control over the signal characteristics. So instead, I prefer to add an external pull-up resistor. That way I know exactly what value I'm working with and I get a much more stable and predictable input signal. So overall, the current design is functional, but adding a simple RC debounce and an external pull-up would make it a lot more robust and reliable. And there we have it. Like I said before, this is really impressive work, especially considering the designer is only 17 years old. When I was 17, I didn't even know what a PCB was, so this is already a really strong start. There are definitely some areas for improvement, but that's part of the process. And overall, this is a solid design with a lot of good decisions. In the next video, we'll go through the PCB layout, and I might also be able to help troubleshoot an issue the designer is having when connecting the board to the computer. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe for more PCB design content, and I'll see you in the next one.